What is up, design family, and welcome back to another episode of Fittdesign TV. On today's episode, we have another one of our technical deep dives where I'm going to be discussing the key differences between cut and sew sportswear leggings and seamless sportswear leggings. So, if you're new to the channel, what essentially does this mean? Well, we have to understand that cut and sew and seamless are not created equal. They may serve the same functionality as a sportswear legging, but they're constructed differently. Cut and sew is your traditional manufacturing facility. Essentially, you buy a roll of fabric and we draft a 2D pattern onto that fabric and we cut out that fabric and we sew the garment together according to that pattern. Hence the name cut and sew. With seamless, there is some sewing and some cutting involved, but predominantly the fabric itself is knitted by a specialized tubular knitting machine, typically by a company called Santoni. They're the biggest, and the machine creates the tube, and then we cut away the excess fabric, and then we just have a seam where that excess fabric is cut out. So the core differences is something we've covered before on the channel, but on today we're going to do a technical deep dive. I'm opening up two separate tech packs. One that you can see above here, which is the seamless product, and then the bottom, which is the cut and sew product. What are we going to be looking at? Well, we're going to be looking at, number one, the key sizing differences. So for a size small of a cut and sew and a size small of a seamless, what are the differences? How does the outseam versus the waist half width versus the inseam differ? Then we're going to be looking at the spec differences. So what type of printing methods do we apply, or branding application methods? What type of seam work do we apply on each? What type of finishing do we apply? What type of fabric as well should we necessarily consider for cut and sew and then seamless? And then lastly, we'll look at the sizing guide. How do the sizing guide instruments or the increments increase between sizes? So without further ado, if you've ever been interested in either or, this is going to be the episode for you. Let's go into the sizing differences first. So the actual measurement differences. You'll see above here, I have a technical sheet for a size small seamless, and then the same one for a cut and sew. One thing you have to understand is these are both the scale. They're a 1 to 10 scale, and if you were to wear both of these leggings, they would actually fit you the exact same. So here we can see an outseam, which is the total length of 32 inches on a size small versus 36.5 inches on a size small of a cut and sew. So you might be asking yourself, well, where is this increase coming from? Does this mean that they're going to fit completely different? On the contrary, with seamless, the fabric itself, since it's knit on a tube, typically has a lot more stretch. It has approximately around 25 to 35% more stretch. So the same amount of fabric that's compressed stretches out to fill out that difference. That's something that you need to understand as the key difference. You can't just design a seamless legging and take a cut and sew legging as a reference. What is the easiest way to know the difference between a seamless and a cut and sew? Typically, it's going to come in the finishing. With seamless, if you have a straight waistband, so something like this where it's just a straight waistband, typically the finishing here is going to be known as a blind catch stitch, which is just an invisible stitch. It looks something like this. You don't see the stitch from the outside. It's just a very, very minor stitch that you can see. Versus with a cut and sew, the legging or the finishing between the waistband and the main body fabric typically tends to be some sort of plain seam with a 3-needle thread just to help seal it in together. So with this one, it's a manual operation, and with this one, with the seamless, it is a machine operation. So that's kind of like one of the easiest ways to tell. It's between the waistband and the main body, and then this one is between the waistband and the main body. So one thing we have to understand is the measurements differ. The outseam, even the waist, you can see the waist on a size small seamless is 10 inches versus the waist here is around 10.5 inches. Even the front rise differs. The front rise is around 9.25 inches, and then the front rise here is around 10 inches. So everything is increasing, even the inseam. Whereas what you have here is a 24-inch inseam on the size small. Here you have a 27.5, but effectively, they both will be relatively the same fit when you visually look at them. So that's essential to understand. Another thing that we have to look at is going to be the fabric that is typically used on a seamless versus a cut and sew. Usually with seamless, you tend to see either nylon and spandex with a third fabric blend. So you have your nylon. Here we're calling it polyamide, which is the same thing. Polyester and elastane, aka spandex. So why do we have polyester and nylon being implemented here? It's simple. With seamless, you typically have what are known as front-facing yarns and back-facing yarns. It's a function of the tubular construction and the fact that you have two sets of needles coming in from either direction. Usually on the front-facing yarn, it tends to have a specific property that the back-facing yarn doesn't have. This is what allows you to achieve a variety of different knits, textures into the garment that you can't necessarily achieve with cut and sew. That's why we tend to see polyester and nylon being blended in, versus with cut and sew, it tends to just be a straight either polyester or a nylon. You don't tend to see a mix of the two. Of course, spandex is always added here. Then we'll look at the difference in the thickness of the fabric. You'll notice here we have a 340 GSM versus here what we have is a 160 GSM. This is important. I would say this is more even of a 210 GSM, not a 160. So you might be asking yourself, oh, does this mean that a seamless legging is that much more? It's almost double or 1.5x the thickness of a cut and sew legging. Not necessarily. What we have to understand is this is a grams per square meter of fabric. But we already acknowledged the fact that with seamless, the fabric is a lot more compact just simply because of the knitting. The same amount of fabric that you have in here is stretched out to fit a 36.5 inch because they both effectively fit the same. So that same thickness of 310 GSM is accurately being used across the entire body versus with a cut and sew legging, that same fabric is fitting the same amount. So it's being stretched out. So the fabric with a cut and sew is a lot less dense than the fabric with a seamless because it has to be stretched out way less. Also, you tend to see with seamless, you use less spandex versus with cut and sew, you use more spandex. So why is that? Again, it comes down to the inherent way that the fabric is actually knit. With a seamless, the fabric tends to have more inherent stretch in terms of its core knit that you don't even need to have that much more spandex versus with cut and sew, you're making up for that lack of stretch in the inherent fabric itself by adding more spandex. So you tend to see more spandex in a cut and sew versus with a seamless. So this is essentially the differences between the types of fits. Also, when it comes to the overall finishing, I've already mentioned this before, but with seamless, the machine can employ what is known as a blind catch stitch. So you'll notice here on our technical sheet, we don't have any clear finishing for either the waistband or the bottom hem. This is because simply the machine itself can create a fold and stitch the fabric with a nice, beautiful blind stitch. Whereas with cut and sew, that's not possible. We have to actually fold the fabric ourselves and top stitch it ourselves. So that is one of the big key differences. Now we'll look at the basic specs. What is the difference between the basic specs of a seamless and a cut and sew? Well, here we have to understand that with seamless, there's a lot more that we can do in the garment itself that is not available for cut and sew. So because with seamless, we're knitting the fabric as we go along. We're able to bring in different knit, different levels of compression, different patterns, different designs into the garment. You can see here, this is not a physical seam. This is simply a part of the fabric where we're going from a regular single jersey knit to a 2x2 knit. And then as we reach the waistband, we go for a 1x1, and then we go for a single jersey, then we go for a 2x2. This allows us to bring in different aesthetic designs, different levels of compression, and it just creates a more intriguing and functional design overall. Versus with cut and sew, if we wanted to bring in that level of sort of difference in functionality, we would literally need to cut the fabric and apply a different fabric of a different compression and then have a seam finishing on it. So this is one of the big advantages that seamless has over cut and sew. What does cut and sew have as an advantage over seamless? Well, it comes down to the practicality of the garment. With seamless, you typically tend to see these garments being used specifically for sportswear and in the gym. They just have a very sporty appearance. With cut and sew, a lot of those leggings that you see used on a day-to-day basis tend to be cut and sew. The fabric's just, it looks like a fabric that is premium that you would want to wear on a day-to-day basis. It has that more approachable and that versatile appeal that cut and sew or seamless simply doesn't have. Another thing, with seamless, the type of construction of the fabric tends to be a single jersey, which is just a regular loop knit, that's because the machine that creates seamless garments tends to only knit in that specific way, and then it can essentially modify that knit to achieve different patterns, different structures, but the core knit type is a single jersey. Versus with seamless, well, with cut and sew, well, we can have an interlock knit, which has a doubled up knit, which is less sheer, which is more compressive, which is more compact. We can have a double jersey. We can have a mesh knit. So there's a variety of different types of fabrics that we can bring in to cut and sew to make up for that lack of visual variety. But of course, that means that if we want to mix and match two different fabrics, we need to cut and sew. With seamless, we're not mixing two different fabrics. What we're doing is two different types of knits that the machine can be programmed to do as it moves along. You'll notice both of these garments have diamond crotch gussets. With seamless, you actually can have a garment that doesn't have a front rise or a back rise. With cut and sew, if you don't have a front rise, you're typically going to need a back rise, and vice versa. So typically with seamless, we tend to see a lot more flexibility over the knit structures. You definitely don't need a side seam. With cut and sew, you can have a side seam. With seamless, you can have a waistband that's very tapered simply by employing different levels of knits as you go along that don't need to have a cut in them. With cut and sew, depending on how tapered the waistband is, this one isn't that tapered, you may have to have a side seam in order to create that cut. So if we're going from like 13.5 to a very snatched waist of anything less than 10.5, which is I would say 10 or 9.5, then you definitely would need those side seams in order to bring in that snatching effect. So that's kind of what you need to understand regarding that snatching effect. Then we look at different branding elements. So how do you brand seamless versus cut and sew? Seamless has a big advantage in the sense that you can knit the branding directly into the fabric. This just makes it a lot more durable. It stretches with the fabric so it doesn't wear away over time. It's great in the sense of it feels like it's completely integrated, doesn't cause any additional irritation. Versus with cut and sew, you're a little bit more limited in the sense that you have to go for some sort of heat transfer, screen print. Embroidery, I wouldn't typically recommend with a cut and sew sportswear garment just because of the fabric has a lot more stretch. So as soon as you pierce the fabric, you could end up tearing it. So you're typically limited to screen printing, heat transfer, and sublimation. Sublimation has its unique advantages, but in general, screen printing and heat transfer. You can still use these on seamless, but because of the added stretch and the fact that the fabric might have some more texture, sometimes heat transfer tends to not be the preferred method. I definitely would not put a heat transfer logo on the waistband here just because the waistband has a lot more grooves than it does on a cut and sew fabric. So you can see here with this Alphalete example, the ribbing would actually get in the way of applying a heat transfer because the fabric or the heat transfer material would not have a flat surface in order to lay flat on and could potentially come up over time. So that's the key differences in terms of the branding elements that we can have onto them. Also, with cut and sew, you tend to be able to sublimate, which is not possible with seamless. I mean, it is possible, but it is not preferred just because you end up losing the advantages of seamless. You have to then use a polyester blend and you have to have a high amount of polyester, and then you have to bring in another factory to do the sublimation. So it's not preferred. With cut and sew, sublimation is possible. With cut and sew, you can do a flatbed printing method to bring in like a camel print or like a nice floral print. So there's a lot more all over print techniques that you can do with cut and sew that you cannot do with seamless. Lastly, when it comes to all over prints, with seamless though, you probably are catching on that you can modify the way that the machine is knitting the fabric as it moves up in order to bring in different jacquard knits. So if you've ever seen like the Gymshark seamless camel leggings, that faint camel pattern is being able to be brought into the garment simply by changing up the knitting pattern of the design as it goes along in order to mimic that camel pattern. With cut and sew, that's not possible. You'd actually need to print the camel directly onto it, which we don't recommend. So there's differences here that you can do. Then we'll look at the different types of seams that you use on the garments. We've already mentioned that on cut and sew, it's a traditional method of bringing a fabric, drafting a 2D pattern onto it, cutting it out, and then stitching it using different machines. Overlock machines, you can have plain seam machines, you can have simple top stitching. All of these are possible options. With cut and sew, or with seamless, you typically are limited to either have a blind catch stitch on the bottom, on the top where the waistband is, and on the hemline, or for the inseam, you'll notice here, you definitely have to have a stitch because it's just going to be where the excess fabric is removed, and that typically needs to be a flat seam. It's not recommended to have a plain seam, which you could potentially have on seamless or on a cut and sew. It's because of how much the fabric stretches, and it could definitely be easy to tear off over time. So with seamless, you tend to be a lot more prone to the garment tearing over time just because of the inherent stretch of the fabric. So you have to be very careful what type of seams you employ. Whereas with cut and sew, you have a lot more potential to bring in a variety of different types of seams, top stitch seams, cover stitch seams, chain stitch seams. All of these are potential options. Now, we'll move on to the last part of the process, which is going to be the sizing chart and how these sizes increase. You'll notice here with cut and sew, I have extra small to extra large. With seamless, I have extra small just to large. So there's a smaller sizing range versus with the cut and sew. Why is this? Well, it comes down to two things. Number one is the way that garments are manufactured in seamless is different than with cut and sew. With seamless, each machine can only make one size of fabric or one size of garment. With leggings, there's a specific circumference of tube that is usually used for an extra small versus another circumference of tube machine that is used for a small. And then the excess fabric is just simply cut from the inseam and it's stitched together. So the overhead for seamless in terms of what a manufacturer is able to make for you will require them to be much more selective about how low of a quantity that they can go for when they are dealing with seamless versus cut and sew. So we tend to see seamless have smaller sizing ranges versus cut and sew, where it's essentially a human can come in and can cut the fabric according to what the size of the garment needs to be, according to the pattern itself that's being used. So you tend to see a lot more specificity in the fits that you have with cut and sew. Doesn't mean that a seamless is going to fit in a much less specific way, but it just means that you tend to see fewer sizing options with seamless simply because of the manufacturing methods that are used. But I would say this, I would say if you are a size small on cut and sew, you could definitely get away with using or purchasing a size medium with seamless and having it still fit snug just because of how much the fabric compresses. So you can kind of be in between sizes with seamless and comfortably fit into them, versus with cut and sew, you tend to have to stick to your size specifically simply because of the relatively less stretch of the fabric. In terms of the grading, both of them tend to grade similarly. With the outseams, you tend to see around 0.5 typically. With the outseam on a cut and sew, you tend to see 0.5. I would say you could stretch up to around 0.625 on a cut and sew. So in terms of the amount of increase between a size small outseam, which is the length of the outer edge, you can see here, denoted right here, versus the length of the outer edge on a seamless tends to be 0.5, just again because of how much more the fabric stretches on a seamless. It doesn't have to increase as much between size to size. Same thing for the front rise, typically around 0.25 or 0.375 on a front rise here, and then here you tend to see 0.5 to like 0.25 depending on which increase you're going for. So in general, the grading on a cut and sew is around, I would say 10 to 15% more per size increase than that of a seamless if you want to get a perfect garment construction. So that's essentially the key differences between seamless. So where should you use the seamless garment and where should you use a cut and sew garment? If your focus is on creating a garment that is purely focused on performance, on functionality, you want to experiment with the different types of aesthetic designs, then go for seamless. If you're focused on creating a more versatile legging that can be used on a day-to-day basis, that you potentially want to pair with items that are non-gym related, then go with cut and sew. If your manufacturing quantities are higher, but you want to achieve a lower price per unit, go for seamless. If you focus much more on quality and you want a potentially lower MOQ, but you don't mind paying more per unit, then go for cut and sew. So guys, that has been it. That's been my technical recap over the key differences between cut and sew and seamless leggings. I apologize if there were some sounds in the background. I'm currently out of the office, but I wanted to get this episode out for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you guys enjoyed it, please consider smashing a massive thumbs up. It really does help us out, keeps us motivated to keep pumping out this content for you. I say this from the very bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Fit Design TV. Until next week's episode, stay awesome.